So next slide. So today our topic is going to be making sure that you are factoring in emotion as part of the customer experience as you're crafting those. I, Sheridan Orr, will be your host today, and I am the Director of Product Marketing at NICE for our Customer Journey Solutions line of business. And you can catch me on Twitter at Sheridan Orr, and I'm honored to introduce our presenter, Megan Burns, who's the Vice President and Principal Analyst of the Customer Experience Practice at Forrester Research, and you can engage with Megan on Twitter at MBDXP. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan, to tell us how we're going to use emotion in our customer experience.
Great. Thank you, Sheridan, and thanks, everybody, for joining us today. This is a fun topic for me to talk about, and it's one that I started researching really back at the beginning of 2015. And to give you a sense of why we ended up talking about and researching this topic of emotion, it helps to understand a little bit about where the overall zeitgeist is around customer experience inside companies. And when we asked over 200 customer experience professionals, well, how good do your executives want to be from a customer experience perspective? We found that most companies have some pretty ambitious goals, right? 50% of them want to be the industry leader in customer experience. Another 33% want to be a customer experience leader across all industries, right? So they want to become the next Nordstrom, the next Starbucks, the next Ritz-Carlton. And those goals are, unfortunately, pretty far away from most companies' reality. So in addition to asking customer experience professionals, we also survey upwards of 45,000 consumers every year and ask them, okay, so how good actually was your customer experience with these brands? And we do that for about 300 brands in the U.S. And what we find is that, for the most part, customer experiences are okay, according to customers. 57% of the companies in our benchmark got a score of okay, right? 15% were good and only 1% were excellent. And even in some industries, even the company that is the leader at customer experience is still not very good. They're just the best of a bunch that needs work. We sometimes call this the tallest bonsai tree in the forest. And so companies are actively focused on getting better, which is great. And they're focused on getting better at the elements of customer experience, the dimensions of customer experience that define, well, what is a good experience? And those three are effectiveness, which is, well, did we deliver the value that the customer wanted in the experience? Ease, pretty self-evident, right? How hard was it to get that value? And emotion, which is how did the experience make the customer feel? So these are the three dimensions that we measure in that Customer Experience Index benchmark. And one of the questions that we get all the time from clients is, well, is one of these more important than the other two? And most companies instinctively think that it's ease. And if they're focused on anything, they're focused on effectiveness and ease, the much more functional aspects of customer experience. But the data actually shows that emotion has a bigger influence on customer loyalty than effectiveness and ease in 17 of the 18 industries that we look at in our benchmark. Now, I can tell you that the 18th industry is the wireless industry, and emotion and ease are tied. So it's not that emotion isn't important, it's just that it's not the number one. It's tied for first place with ease. And when we repeated this analysis using data from our benchmark in Europe, we found very much the same dynamic, right? In UK, 8 out of 8 industries, emotion was the most important. In Germany, 5 out of 6. In France, only 3 out of 7, so that's pretty interesting. We're looking into that. But generally speaking, emotion is an enormous factor in how an experience affects a customer's loyalty. But we didn't want to just rely on our own data. We always like to get external validation. And so we started talking to companies that had been using their own data to explore this same concern. And their data confirmed what our data showed. One of the first companies I talked to was FedEx, and they've been studying this emotion and customer experience concept for 3 or 4 years now. And they looked at how much of customer loyalty is based on your personal customer experience with FedEx. And then of that, how much of it is based on the rational perception of the customer experience and how much is based on the emotional perception. And as you would expect, right, our rational perception of the experience was really important. It accounted for about 1/3 of customer loyalty. But the emotional experience was more important. It accounted for roughly half of customer loyalty. And we heard similar things from Scottrade, the investment firm. They did an interesting study where they asked a group of satisfied customers. Everyone was satisfied. One group, however, said in addition to being satisfied, they felt an emotional connection to the brand. And so they asked satisfied customers and emotionally connected customers some of the classic loyalty questions. And they found that that emotional connection made people 2 times less likely to switch their business from Scottrade to a competitor, 5 times more likely to enrich the relationship, to invest more money with Scottrade, and they were 2 times more likely to have actually forwarded information about the company to friends and family. Now, we talked to a bunch more companies in addition to this, and without a doubt, their data and our data combined sent a very clear message, which is that you can't afford to neglect your customer's emotional experience. And I mean that figuratively, and I also mean it quite literally from a financial perspective. But one of the challenges with emotional customer experience, one of the reasons that companies haven't paid attention to it as much in the past, is even when you're trying to get it right, it's really hard. Emotions are illogical, they're unpredictable, they vary widely from customer to customer, and so it's a very daunting thing to think about. But we have proof that it is possible to get it right. So we did a sort of a sub-calculation using that same data from the Customer Experience Index. We wanted to look at how many companies on the whole get customer experience, the emotional side of customer experience, right. And how is that different? How is that balance of emotionally good experiences, emotionally bad experiences different from company to company? And what we found was that the leaders, the top 15 scoring brands out of all 300, deliver 28 positive experiences for every 1 negative experience. So they get it right the vast majority of the time. But even on average, the average company was 13 to 1. Half, less than half, but still more positive experiences than negative experiences. Unfortunately, among the laggards in the benchmark, that ratio was 2 to 1. So fully 1/3 of the experience that their customers are having with them is negative. So we wanted to help people understand if you're in one of these 2 groups, either average or laggards, how do you get better? How do you make it so that more of your customers' experiences leave them feeling good at the end of the day? And one of the first things that we found is that you really need to understand how emotions work. Yes, they do seem unpredictable and they seem illogical, but it turns out that there is some structure to how they work, and behavioral economists have been doing a lot of work in the last couple decades understanding how all of these things work. It may not be logical, but it is very predictable. And so we spent a couple months doing a study of the academic literature and talking to folks who study behavioral economics, and we identified 3 basic rules of human emotion that customer experience professionals need to know to get started tackling this concept of emotional customer experience. And I'm going to share those 3 with you right now. The first one is that we're more sensitive to negative experiences than positive ones. So basically the deck is stacked against us no matter what we do. And this is really an evolutionary function. There's a part of our brain that has honed in on looking for threats, and that's all it's looking for 24/7. So we're more likely to see them, and when we detect something negative, our body feels it anywhere from 2 to 5 times more strongly than when we detect something that could be positive. Basically, that means we're risk averse, because ignoring a risk is a lot more dangerous than missing out on an opportunity. So we've been biologically structured to be more sensitive to and pay more attention to the negative parts of our experience with anyone, a company, a person, a friend, than we are to the positive. Now, there's a slight silver lining in that, which is that we actually don't remember past experiences with much accuracy. So we'll notice and feel the negative experiences more strongly, but we won't necessarily remember all of them. There's a rule called the peak end rule. And what behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman have found is that when you look at how someone remembers an experience, do they remember it as positive or negative afterward? It's not logical. It's an average of the peak point of the experience, the most emotionally intense, and the end, how you felt at the end. And to kind of bring that home to real life, what it basically means is if you go to a restaurant, and you go to a great restaurant, and you spend 2 hours having a wonderful dinner, and the service is great, and the food is great, and then as you're getting ready to leave, and let's say you have theater tickets and you need to get to the theater, suddenly the server disappears right when you want the check, right? We've all had that. Let's say that person disappears for 10 minutes. From a purely economic perspective, you had 2 hours of great experience and 10 minutes of negative experience. But that 10 minutes of negative experience, because they came at the very end, are going to cause you to remember the entire dinner as more negative than it actually was. And that can work for us and against us in customer experience depending on how well we handle the end of an experience. And if that's happened to you, chances are you didn't realize that your memory was skewed the way it was. Because the third big rule of emotion that affects customer experience is that we aren't aware of everything we feel. Emotions often happen in the subconscious, and we start feeling emotions long before we have any sort of language to describe them, right? If you've ever heard a baby cry, that baby is having an emotional response to something, absolutely can't describe it. And so that I can feel it, but I can't quite describe its sensation is very real, and it has very biological roots. And what it means for us as customer experience professionals is that even the customers who want to help us with the emotional experience and are willing to tell us as much as they possibly can only give us a part of the picture because they just aren't capable of articulating some aspects of their emotional experience. So these rules certainly make managing emotional experience a challenge. But we went and talked to a number of the companies that get this right, many of whom were high scorers in our customer experience index, some of whom were companies that we've just come across over the years that we know do very well in this area, even if we didn't have data on them. And after speaking to these companies and asking them, well, you know, how do you manage emotional customer experience, we found 4 common best practices. And so I'm going to share those 4 with you because they're really something any company can do. And the first best practice that these companies do is that they understand the emotional context around each interaction. Because as it turns out, whether or not we see an experience as positive or negative has a lot to do with how we felt when we started the experience, right? Practically speaking, if I go somewhere and someone does something annoying, but I've been having a pretty good day, it might be annoying, but it's not that big a deal. If I've been having a really bad day, what would otherwise be a normal annoyance just drives me bonkers, right? We've all experienced that. So understanding the emotional context sometimes I call this the emotional baggage, if you will, that customers bring to an interaction will give you a lot of insight into how they are likely to respond emotionally to whatever happens in this journey that you're designing for them. And some of the emotional context comes just from what's going on in the world around us. I did a quick look at Forrester's consumer technographics data, and it wasn't hard to find statistics. 55% of people said that they are worried about the economy. Right? It's not necessarily something that they're worried about your company or they're buying something and they think, oh my God, it's too expensive. It's not that conscious. But there's a general concern in the back of their mind that's there all the time. Another 75% are worried about having enough money to retire. 70% were worried about the privacy of their personal information and their credit card information. And 52% were actually worried about giving their credit card information to a company because they're afraid that they could become the victims of identity theft. These are things that are swirling around in people's heads that affect how they respond to their experience with your company, even if they're not aware of it. And so we have to think about and be aware of, what are the subtle cues that they use to decide, hey, is this experience secure or not? And depending on how worried they are about security, those clues can make them feel more or less negative. So understanding that kind of broader macro context is important. But these companies also look at how customers feel, the emotional context around the business that they're in, and just what's going on in their lives. And one great example of this that we've seen comes from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. So they created 3 customer personas, 3 archetypes that describe the basic groups of customers that they serve. But they weren't just looking at, what kind of health insurance do they need or what health conditions do they have. They looked at what this person's life is like. And these are some pictures from the customer experience room that they built. It's a little bit like a museum exhibit. And if you look at the picture in the top right, you can see this quote, Mike is one of their personas, right? Cluttered. That describes Mike's desk and his mind. Why? Well, the fact that Mike has a cluttered mind is really important, because if he is getting that stack of mail on the bottom that says overwhelmed, and his mind is already cluttered with a lot of other things, that's going to cause even more anxiety than someone who is, not feeling all that cluttered in their head, but then suddenly gets this barrage of information. And not only did they do the research to understand this, they used this customer experience room to make sure that every employee in the company had a sense of this emotional context so that they could better predict and anticipate how a customer that they were working with might respond to a particular event. Now, you don't always have the luxury of being able to talk to customers directly during the interaction to pick up on the emotional context that they're bringing. So there are techniques you can use to anticipate that ahead of time and factor that into the design of your digital experiences. And Vanguard, the investment company, did this using what's called an emotional inventory. They interviewed a bunch of investors, some were customers, some were not, and asked them to circle the emotion words that best describe how they feel when the interviewer talks about the topic of investing overall. Investing for retirement, investing for a child's college education, right? There are different emotions associated with all of those different types of investing. And they used what they learned from there to factor into the design. They were doing a redesign of their public site. So, for example, new investors are often overwhelmed by just the topic of investing. And so if you go to the Vanguard site, you will find that in the public parts of the site, there's a lot of white space. There's not a lot of words, and the words are very simple. And that's quite intentional, because subconsciously, whether we realize it or not, putting a lot of information on a website page exacerbates that feeling of being overwhelmed. You're visually overwhelmed, your brain is trying to take it in more. And so understanding that that was the frame of mind that new investors were going to be in, they said, we don't want anything in the design of our experience to make that problem any worse. Now, one of the challenges of the emotional inventory activity, though, is that it only gives you a part of the picture, because if you remember, one of the rules of emotion is that we aren't aware of everything that we feel. And so companies that get customer experience really, really right find ways to, going in the wrong direction. They find ways to unmask the emotions that customers can't put into words. And there are a couple of really powerful and I think really copyable techniques that these companies are using. The first one that I want to talk about is called metaphor elicitation. And what it basically does is asking people to bring in pictures or to talk about concepts that represent how they want to feel during an experience, or how they do feel during an experience. And one company in particular, Medica, which is a health insurance company, they asked people to bring in pictures of how they wanted to feel when interacting with their health insurance company. And one woman brought in a picture of chocolate chip cookies. And people kind of went, well, that's interesting. Why did you choose a picture of chocolate chip cookies? And she said, well, first of all, chocolate chip cookies just make me happy. And I want my interactions with any company to make me happy. But there's something about chocolate chip cookies when they come out of the oven that reminded her of when her mother would bake them for her when she was a little girl. Sitting at the kitchen table, eating those fresh baked chocolate chip cookies made her feel very loved, right? Very cared for, very protected. And from a research perspective, asking someone to circle words on an emotional inventory and seeing them circle cared for, protected, happy. Intellectually, we can understand what that experience felt like and how it is this customer wants to feel. But in terms of cultivating empathy and really internalizing the emotion that this customer wants to experience, this metaphor of the way I used to feel when my mom would make me chocolate chip cookies is incredibly more powerful because it captures those nuances and those little things that we can't put into words. We actually, though, do have some tells where we give away some of these emotions that we have trouble articulating. And so if we take a step past just asking people, talking to people, and we listen to what they say and in particular how they say it, we can also get a much deeper picture of the emotions that they're feeling in real time during an experience or after an experience, you know, someone called into the call center. And this is where technology is really coming into this world of emotional experience. Probably the most popular technique for unmasking hidden emotions is voice analytics, using either text analytics or audio recording analytics based on how fast someone is talking, the pitch of their voice, the volume of their voice, and changes in all of those things, being able to detect whether someone is confused, upset, happy. Some of the cognitive linguists that I interviewed for this research told me that human beings, when we're just listening to each other and we don't have visual body language cues, we can pick up on the other person's emotions correctly about 65% of the time. And the technology has actually gotten to the point where it's about as good as we are in picking up on someone's emotions only using their voice. And so companies are using this to review call center calls, logs, chat transcripts to understand how did a customer respond emotionally to an experience over the course of time. Helps them coach their employees and helps them understand how they might need to change parts of the experience in the way it's designed because maybe people are reacting to it more strongly than you anticipated that they would have. But it's a very, very powerful tool for studying those emotions. And there are some companies that are actually using this in real time. For example, if you're working with a speech-based IVR, there are companies that are now using this to detect when someone's frustration level starts to grow. And when it hits a certain point, they'll kick you over to an agent. They'll take you out of the virtual agent and over to a real agent because, you know, you sort of hit your limit of talking to a machine. And that's very much the direction that this kind of technology is going, is much more application in real time. There's some really interesting technology work being done around detecting emotion, not just in the voice, but in the face. And one company in particular that I ran across is a spin-off. They're called Affectiva, and they spun off of the MIT Media Lab. And they use video of facial movements. And this is rooted in research that actually started in 1965 by a gentleman named Paul Ekman, who studies how we show emotion on our face. And it turns out there's some similarities. There's some universal things that we can look at in terms of features and movement, and we can detect the emotions that someone is feeling. And so having a webcam in front of someone while they are watching a commercial, that's actually the most common application right now, is for marketing purposes, to understand how does this commercial make the person feel. Are some of them more emotionally resonant than others? But this technology can also be used, and we're encouraging it to be used, for testing digital experiences. So if someone is using a mobile app, or if someone is sitting in front of a website in a usability lab, not only being able to see what they're doing and listen to the things that they're saying, because we usually ask people to talk out loud and talk about what they're feeling, but there can be, you know, really short moments of confusion. That's like a little crinkle of the eye that they might never mention to you, or you as a researcher might not see, and this kind of technology can pick up on it. And there's some work being done that's heading even further into what I think of as the sci-fi territory, but it's really, really interesting, and if they can do it, it's going to be really powerful. Many of the major advances that we've seen in understanding human emotion and emotional response came from functional MRIs and being able to actually look at how the parts of someone's brain is lighting up when they're having an experience to understand the emotions that they're feeling. But you can imagine that it's pretty hard to put one of these giant MRI machines on the left in a retail store or in a bank branch to understand how a customer is feeling when they're going through a transaction. That contraption on the right is being developed by the University of San Diego, and that is basically the same technology. It's a technology that is going to enable us to do a functional MRI of someone's brain and understand how the emotional centers of their brain are lighting up in a much more practical way for testing real-life customer experience scenarios. So our ability to pick up on all of these subtleties and unconscious aspects of emotion is better, frankly, than I thought it was when I started this research, and it's getting even better, and it's getting better very quickly. So once you know what those emotions are that somebody's feeling, one of the most important things that companies that get emotion right do, and they do consistently, is that they weed out systemic customer pain points. And I know this kind of sounds like, well, duh, right? Almost every company is doing this, whether it's from an emotional perspective or not, right? We're doing customer journey maps, we're looking for pain points in the experience, and we're eliminating them. This is a really critical piece of managing emotional customer experience because of that very first rule that I mentioned, which is that we are much more sensitive to negative emotions than positive ones. What that means is that removing pain is going to change the experience more than adding a relatively equivalent amount of pleasure. So an example that behavioral economists often use to describe this is that when I lose 20 bucks, I feel 2 to 5 times worse than I would feel good if I randomly found 20 bucks on the floor. So in terms of bang for your buck, weeding out customer pain points in the experience is going to do more to improve the emotional experience than adding delight points. And we've seen a lot of companies try to add delight points before they weed out pain points, and customers are like, I'd settle for you just getting my bill right. You know, please don't try to wow me, just get my bill right. And again, there are a lot of technologies that companies are using and tools that companies are using to help them do that. Text and voice analytics is absolutely one of them. You know, you can look for emotions that are positive and negative, and one of the most common applications of text analytics is looking for themes in what it is that people are struggling with in the experience. Now, this is just a general word cloud that we generated at Forrester from some social media data that we were looking at, but this same kind of analysis is helping people find, like if you look in the top left, one of the things that popped up was lack doctor search tool. This is this was used on some health insurance data. That's a very specific indicator of something in the experience that is causing people pain that we can fix. And so they're using the technology not only for research purposes, but also for fixing the experience. Many times the text analytics will give you a high-level sense of what's wrong, but in order to really go deeper and understand where the pain is and what's causing it, companies will use a customer journey map. This is an example of a customer journey map. It happens to come from a company in the telecom industry. And what's powerful about this one is you'll see that on the bottom, they have mapped the emotional experience in addition to mapping the action-based experience, right? What the customer is doing, what they're thinking from a very logical perspective, what touch points they're using. This makes it abundantly clear to anybody who looks at this customer journey where the most intense pain point is, right? It's right there in the middle. But it also captures some of the complexity of emotion that it's important to think about when you're figuring out, okay, well, what would actually make this experience better? So I know the little legend on the bottom is too small to read, so I'll just point some of this out to you. We can see that this particular person, as they're going through this experience, is feeling joy 1 minute and anger the next. But they're feeling surprise at the same time as both of them, right? So we're feeling multiple emotions at once, and it's often that combination of emotions that we need to deal with, because if I'm surprised in a joyful perspective, that's a much different experience than I'm surprised in an angry perspective. And so customer journey maps are an incredibly powerful tool for understanding where the emotional pain is in an experience and addressing it. And I talked earlier about the text analytics and voice analytics data being used increasingly in real time. The same is true of tools that are helping companies weed out customer pain points. One of my favorite examples comes from the London City Airport. So they are using technology to have real-time insight into how people are moving, passengers are moving through the airport, through security, in the various terminals, at different gates. And what this allows them to do is detect situations that are likely to lead to pain, like security is starting to back up, or you know, there's a big crowd around this particular gate and people are struggling to get by in the hallway. And so in real time, they can deploy their resources to prevent those things from turning into painful experience for the passengers in the airport before it ever happens. And this is the direction that anyone who has a physical experience, I think, is ultimately going to be going in. But companies are also using technology to weed out pain points that aren't quite so obvious. And one of my favorite examples is surrounding the anxiety that you feel when someone is coming to pick you up or do some service at your house and they're a total stranger. companies like Uber and Safelite have realized that that's an emotional pain point. And so giving us a picture and a name and a license plate and a description of the Uber driver that's coming to pick us up or the technician who's going to come fix the crack in our windshield, that removes an emotional pain point that a lot of us wouldn't have consciously articulated, and frankly, many of us just didn't think there was anything you could do about, right? You have someone come to your home to fix things, and you just have to have somebody home or make sure your dog is there, right? It's just something you have to deal with. Companies are finding ways to use technology to weed out even those small little blips of anxiety that customers could feel across the experience and make them much more reassured. And so continue on. If you're on this webinar, chances are your company is actively working to weed out customer pain points. Keep going. And once you have tackled most of the major pain points, and even if you haven't gotten to all of them yet, think about the end of the experience. Because remember I talked earlier about the fact that we don't remember experiences as they actually happened, that the end of the experience has a above average impact on how we remember our emotion of the experience. Companies that get emotional experience right not only know this, they use it to make sure that no matter what, they always end an experience on a high note. Now, that could be a situation where an experience wasn't great, and they find some way to make it better, recover at the end. One of my favorite examples of this came from a colleague of mine here at Forrester. We fly a lot, we travel a lot, and she was an ultra platinum, whatever the distinction is, frequent flyer on Delta Airlines. And so she pretty much gets whatever seat she wants. But there was one day where she was flying and she got stuck in a middle seat. And the agents at the gate were wonderful. They tried everything they could to get her an aisle seat. She, oh my God, we're so sorry, we wish you could. She had booked this ticket very last minute, so she's like, okay, middle seats happen. But the next morning, she got an email from Delta saying, we're very sorry that we couldn't make the experience what we wanted it to be for you. So we're going to, first of all, we want to apologize. And second of all, we're going to give you 500 extra bonus points in your account for the trouble. Now, Cheryl, being a marketing analyst, of course, picked up the phone and called somebody at Delta and said, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And it turns out this is a formal program called Middle Seat Mondays. And the genius in this program is that not only has Delta made the end of the experience better, they've actually changed the end of the experience from the moment that Cheryl got off that plane to the moment that she received this email. They extended the experience and made the end further away from some of the parts of the experience that weren't so great, which can change the way that someone will remember the entire experience, right? Cheryl's going to focus more now on this great little surprise that she got at the end of the experience than on the discomfort she had sitting in a middle seat for this particular flight. And I have one other example of this that I think is really, really powerful that I just want to share with you, and it comes from Sweden, and it comes in particular from a blood bank in Sweden. And what I like about this example is that donating blood is a negative experience to begin with, right? It's not fun to be stuck with a needle. But people do it because of a bigger emotional reason. They want to help other people. And so even though they voluntarily go through this not-so-great experience of donating blood, the blood bank has found a way to end the experience on the high note of connecting with that personal desire to help someone else. So you go, you give blood, and then it could be a week, it could be a month later, I don't actually know how that works, but when the blood that you donated is actually used to help a patient, you get a text message. Once again, moving the end of the experience out beyond where it normally would have been, but also changing that end so that instead of it being, you know, standing up a little dizzy and getting a cookie and some juice, you get that warm, fuzzy feeling of, wow, somebody out there was having a medical crisis, and the fact that I had given blood helped them. So there are 4, that's the last example I'm going to share with you because we're coming up on time, but I hope that these 4 best practices that we found in the research are things that you'll be able to take and use to help your company manage emotional experience more effectively. And I'll just recap them. Understand the emotional context that surrounds your customer's experience with you. Find ways to unmask those unspoken emotions. Weed out those systemic pain points and end on a high note. Now, in my attempt to extend the experience of this webinar, I'm going to give you some links to additional research that you can read from Forrester. So the first one is the report that I've been talking about, the research I've been talking about here, called Understanding the Impact of Emotion on Customer Experience. And my colleague Maxie Schmidt actually followed that up with a report specifically looking at how to measure emotion in customer experience. So if you want to keep the experience of this webinar going, I highly encourage you to go read those reports. There's a lot of grit and a lot more great examples in there. And then to end this portion of the experience on a high note, I always struggle because I set myself up, right? Always end on a high note. Oh, well, then how's she going to end? What I've come to do is end on a quote that I think really brings home why it is we need to remember to think about emotional experience. And it comes from Helen Keller, and it goes this way. The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Sheridan for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. That was riveting and beautifully done. And I'm taking notes on things that I can already do, which is not typically what I usually do. So thank you. And we already have a couple of questions coming in. The first is, so we saw the Blue Cross Blue Shield lab, and that is an amazing example. What about those of us with less budget and less organizational buy-in? Where would you advise us to start with understanding our customer emotion and making sure that we are creating emotional experiences?
It's a great question, and the folks in Michigan did not start out with the support to do something like that. They built to it. And you already have an enormous, I don't care what company you're in, you already have an enormous amount of information about your customers' emotions. You have it in the emails that they're sending you. You have it in the heads of the frontline personnel that they are talking to, right? Going and talking to the voice of the employee and understanding, you know, how are customers responding to this new policy that we set? When they talk to you, when they call you with a question about something, what are they like? What are they saying? What's their overall demeanor? There's a tremendous amount of information that you can get from people about that. And thanks to technology, anybody, any employee in the company could take their smartphone and take the video camera and go spend some time with customers and interview them and record that interview. Obviously, you have to get the person's permission first, but there are so many things about the emotional side of someone's experience that we can see visually that even if we saw them on paper or we saw them in a report, wouldn't necessarily be as powerful. So pulling together a library of the things that you already have that demonstrate your customers' emotions, right? Social listening. Now, social media tends to go to one extreme or another, so you don't necessarily want to assume that it's a representative sample of the emotion of all your customers, but it definitely can give you some great fodder. Start pulling all of that together and showing it to people to start the conversation about, what is the emotional experience that people are having with us. And then as you begin to socialize that more and more, It's certainly not the only piece of the puzzle. There's an interesting thing that happens. I find that a lot of people in business are emotionally attached to the idea that emotions don't matter. So I can show them data from here to next Tuesday about the role of emotions in loyalty, and they somehow doubt the data. So it's certainly not the only thing you need to do, but as part of a concerted effort, it will really start to bring home to people the fact that this emotional experience is something that we need to be more deliberate about understanding and about managing.
Great. And then do you see customer effort score as almost being a proxy for emotion?
Great question. I would say the answer is no, and let me explain why. So customer effort score is really just capturing the ease dimension from our customer experience index, right? Hey, was that easy? There are certainly aspects of the emotion that we feel in an experience that are impacted by whether something was easy or not. But there are also parts of the experience that have nothing to do with whether or not it was easy, right? In another couple weeks, I'll be volunteering at the Boston Marathon. Running a marathon is not easy, but it's incredibly emotional and things that people do voluntarily. I have had experiences that were easy. I once called a taxi to take me to the airport, and I got in the taxi, and the driver said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "The airport." And she said, "Oh, it's like the 4th time I've had to go to the airport today." Didn't take any longer for me to get from point A to point B, and it was relatively easy, but emotionally that wasn't my most pleasant car ride. So there are definitely aspects of the emotional experience that are above and beyond ease. Certainly if something's not easy, it's much less likely than it's going to be positive emotionally, but they are distinct concepts that overlap. So you want to be careful using it as a proxy just because it doesn't tell the whole story.
Great. And so in your experience, where does customer emotion live in the organization? Is it with the brand? Is it with marketing? What do you typically see?
Well, I'll tell you about what I typically see, and then I'll tell you about what I wish I would see. What I typically see is that the most attention paid to customer emotion does happen in the brand and marketing pieces of the house. Possibly an exception if you're dealing with a service organization. So if it's a services business or the folks who are on the front lines, right, will very often have soft skills training and emotional intelligence training for contact center reps and things like that. But thinking about and talking about emotion as a concept is usually in brand and marketing. And from an emotion perspective in marketing, often it's about emotions around persuasion, right? How do we tap into someone's emotions to get them to do something, which is a different aspect of understanding and managing emotion than just thinking about what is the emotion someone's having. Let's say they're already a customer and they're doing something with us. We're not trying to sell them anything. What is that experience like? So that's where most of the attention tends to be from. Ultimately, what we want to see and what we see in companies that are really good at this is that there is an empathy for customers and an empathy, frankly, for fellow employees all across the company. People are good at picking up on the emotions that customers are having, about responding to them. They're aware of their own emotions, and they can adjust accordingly. Some companies are explicitly making this part of being an employee. Pure Insurance is a company. They have an entire EQ mentoring and training program. It's a big part of how they're differentiating themselves from other insurance companies, is that their people are better able to empathize with and really adjust to how customers are feeling. But it's the reason that USAA tends to hire people who've been in the military, because that's who they're serving, as members of the military and their families. And so those people have a real emotional empathy, whether they're in finance or product development or working in a contact center. The folks at Ritz-Carlton have all of their associates stay in a hotel in a Ritz-Carlton hotel at some point during the year, so that they can really get a sense of what's the emotional experience of being a guest as opposed to just being there when they're at work. Mercedes did something similar. They spent several $1 million giving everyone who works in their dealerships an opportunity to drive a Mercedes, because there's an experience, there's an emotional side of that experience that is a big part of why a lot of people buy a Mercedes. And if you couldn't empathize with that, it would be very hard to make an emotional connection with that customer. So ideally, we see it everywhere, but in practicality right now, most of the conversation comes from brand and marketing.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And I know many of you have already been pinging me about the report that Megan mentioned, and we will be sending that to you as a follow-up to this webinar. And thank you so much for joining us. We have to have you back, Megan.
Oh, it was absolutely my pleasure.
All right. Well, good day, everyone, and we will look for that email from us.